Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and I wanted to thank you so much for joining us tonight for our second virtual wine tasting with Jack Keegan. Jack is a professor emeritus who taught the ever popular viticulture and enology class for 25 years at Miami. Jack's wine class is always full, his chapter wine tastings are always well attended, and tonight is no exception as there are almost 1,200 alumni friends, and family joining us. The Miami University Alumni Association is so excited for the opportunity to bring Jack to you virtually to kick off your weekend with some safe socialization. There is an Ask a Question box located at the bottom of the screen. Somebody will be monitoring these questions throughout, so please feel free to ask any questions you may have, and we will relay them to Jack throughout the tasting. With all of that being said, without further ado, take it away, Jack.
Yes, I wasn't supposed to do that yet, was I, Emily? I went the wrong way. Do I have to go back?
Nope, you're good to go. Go ahead.
I am really excited for all of you to be here. Certainly everyone who has a Miami connection or who doesn't have a Miami connection. What? Yeah, who doesn't have a Miami connection. But of course, we all have a real enjoyment for wine. You were probably lucky you weren't in Oxford today. We had a bit of a gully washer today. And so, again, I can sort of see, I'm hoping, yes. I took a few pictures today just to show you. I know most of you, in fact, sort of missed campus. And so I thought I would show you a few pictures, of course, as I was driving around this morning here, of course, at Harrison, in fact, which is where I teach the wines course now, up on the second floor. And then here looking down towards the Seal. Again, the flowers are beautiful. You know, campus is empty right now, but of course, with all the trees, it makes it really lovely. Robert Frost was right on talking about how beautiful the campus was with the trees. And of course, I had to put in a picture of Beta Bells, simply because it just gives you an idea, and certainly going back to Miami. So again, today, oh, almost forgot. I actually took this picture off of Facebook yesterday. This is actually, again, a Miamian who he's now assistant winemaker at Stoller, and he posted this picture. Even though it's Oregon, it's filled with California poppies. And so that's what you're seeing there. And so this is what the vines look like in Oregon as of 2 days ago. So I thought that would be good for you to see. Again, as usual, I think it's always a good idea to tell you what's happening in the world of wine. And from what I've seen, looking around, e-commerce is now the new normal. The amount of people who are buying wine online, probably many of you, in fact, did for this tasting, has gone up tremendously. And with us not knowing what the new reality will be, that, in fact, is what you see. A couple other things I thought. It's interesting. Hard seltzer, hello, White Claw, makes up now 10% of the beer sales, up 330%, I think, in just the last year. It is just amazing. It was a big story last year. It continues to be a big story. Interestingly enough, 1.75 liters, so in other words, the big handles practically of spirits are hot, as are magnums of wine in 3-liter boxes. Again, people are staying indoors, and so that's what they're doing to a great extent, is buying larger volume of wine so that they don't have to go to the stores often. But interestingly enough, half bottles also, because again, if it's a person or two and they only want a glass of wine, then a 375 will work very well. And I've heard this from so many people, pre-mixed drinks are flying off of the shelves. And so that's certainly what's happening in all of that. I will be happy to take your questions, but I thought it would be really good tonight. What we're going to do is, of course, have some sparkling wines and talk about how sparkling wines are made. I'll try to sort of keep it down, but I've got lots of pictures for you. So, how do you make wine sparkle? One of the ways, of course, most basically, is basically what they do with Coke or Pepsi. You could direct carbonate it. In other words, just add CO2, as you see, just like a soda stream. In fact, I meant to try that experiment. I've actually never done that myself. It's sort of shocking. And I was going to try it and just sort of ran out of time. When I would think about it, I wouldn't be at home. And so I haven't tried it. But those of you who are of an age like myself, you may remember that Paul Masson made a crackling rosé. I have a feeling that it was just carbonated for that. It actually wasn't a bad tasting wine. But for the most part, that's not considered a good wine to have in all of that. Sparkling wines, the original ones were made what was called again, we use French typically, the méthode ancestrale or the méthode rurale. And you see the road rule. In other words, this is how country wines were made. And the thing is, a lot of times it wasn't even, shall we say, necessary, not so much necessary, but they didn't mean to do it. The problem is when you would have a wine and it would be fermenting in the end of the season in October, November, it would get cold. And of course, they didn't have central heating. And so the wine would stop fermenting, even though there was still sugar there. They would bottle it or put in something. Well, in the springtime, when it warmed up, it would begin to ferment again. And so you'd have bubbles form because, of course, carbon dioxide is one of the side things, one of the main things from fermentation. The first ones, in fact, supposedly came from Limoux. The scientists or the churchmen down there feel very strongly in 1535 they made the first sparkling wines. It's not like champagne or other sparkling wines we'll talk about. This is, in fact, where they supposedly first did it. So here it is. So the first sparkling wine, in fact, at Limoux. Now they do make a wine called Blanquette de Limoux, but it's made, in fact, like champagne is. And we'll talk about that in a little bit also. But I thought it was interesting to see. Someone asked me a question. I think actually it's one I answered. I got 175. I tried to answer as many as I could from the previous time, and I will try to answer these also. But someone asked me about Pétillant Naturel, of course, as it would be in French. Pet nats is what we call them, of course, being Americans. And these are wines made in that same manner. These wines have always been made, but they've become very, very trendy with the sort of organic movement and the natural movement, etc. And some of them can be, in fact, quite good. They're all across the board, though, and they come from all over the world. So this is something you may want to pay attention to as a Pétillant Naturel or pet nats. And they, in fact, can be very good. And this was originally how sparkling wines were made. Actually, the first person to make a sparkling wine in the method that we'll talk about most this evening was an Englishman. Christopher Merritt was a member of the Royal Society, and he wrote a treatise on some observations concerning the ordering of wine. What did he do? He took a basic wine, he added sugar to it and yeast, and he got it to get a second fermentation, which in fact is what we will talk about for most of the rest of the evening in all of that. I thought I would start big and work my way sort of small, especially as we're going through the wines. And so the first thing we'll talk about is, in fact, the Charmat or the bulk process. It's also called Martinotti. And if you read things from Italy, not surprisingly, that's the term they use. And here it's because in 1895, Mr. Martinotti came up with this process of putting wine in a large vat under pressure and doing it in that way. We'll talk a little bit more about this. But a gentleman, Eugène Charmat, in France in like 1905, he made some improvements, and most importantly, he patented it. And so consequently, because of that patent, we typically call it the Charmat process. And this is in fact done by bulk. So this is a wines class. We're not going to wait to the end. So let's have our first wine. This is, of course, the La Marca Prosecco. And I am, if I have to sort of figure out exactly, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that I guess I'm here. Am I right, Emily? I hope I'm there.
We lost your video just because of bandwidth right now, so we don't have your video on.
So you can't see me?
No, we can hear you though.
Oh, okay.
But if you just want to keep sharing your slides.
I can keep talking.
Yeah, you can,
actually,
and you can keep sharing your slides if you want to.
And the slides will come up, but I won't?
Yes.
Okay, well then I will share content. Thing. So you can see that? Yes? No? Okay. Actually, then we will talk about later, but then I will open another bottle. Hopefully, we'll be able to see me at some point in time. Well, you might actually luck out and not see me all night. That's probably not a bad idea either. But if you have not, and in fact, we will certainly talk about, but I'm going to open. I was going to open this as all together, but you may, in fact, I'm hoping, in fact, many of you may be already drinking this wine. But the thing that I want you to notice about opening a bottle of sparkling wine, and that's what I'm doing at the moment, is that you can, I never take off the entire foil or capsule because for those of you who took wines under John Dome, he always said that the bottle looked naked, and I agreed with him. And so I usually never take off the entire capsule. But the La Marca is not very big in that. You know, of course, that there's a tab that you have to unwind. And for every single bottle of sparkling wine, there will always be 6 turns. And so when I pull it down, I will turn it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and then it will be open. Okay? And so then it's open like that. Now then, typically when I open a bottle of wine, what I want to use, again, I'm left-handed, you can't see me anyway, but I put my non-dominant hand, in other words, my right hand, up and around the cork. And then what I do is I turn the bottle. And if you do that, right away I notice that the cork is beginning, of course, to come out. But I want to keep that nice, I want to keep control of that. I once had a friend whose wife spent 3 days with a detached retina from getting hit by a cork. And so I think it's really important to do that. So I'm going to turn it again. And of course, it's stable. You lost me completely, didn't you? Okay. I can try. Wait, let me open this bottle of wine. And so, because I'm halfway out, I'm hoping you will be able to hear the, oh, nope, that was a little bit more of a pop than I wanted in there. I can try to turn my camera on again. Stop sharing. Am I there? No. See, my camera's off. For some reason, it went blank. Start my video button, which is, of course, recorder. You mean recorder? Start my video. Okay. Yep. That's back. The light's back on. You can see me? Okay. Heaven forbid. Anyway, so here, of course, is La Marca. I hope you're drinking. God knows I need a drink. This is interesting, though, too. As you can see, this was a new kind of glass. I got this recently, and I've seen these online a few different places, and I thought, oh, I'm going to try it because, as you can see, it's double-walled. And so we'll keep the drink cold. The thing I don't like about it is that it has a really thick lip. And so it's not as comfortable to drink. I thought it might be fine for mimosas or something along those lines with that. So again, I'm going to go back to, actually what I'm going to do, since you're still seeing me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the second bottle so you can see me open a bottle of sparkling wine, just in case you never see me again, okay? Again, as you can see, and can you see this okay? Yes, you should be able to. You can see I'm only taking off the top of it. In fact, usually there's a little red tab. What I find when almost all these wines is there's a little red tab, and it almost never works to take off the top of the capsule. Ah, that one did. And so you take that off, and there, of course, is the tab, as you can see right there. I won't hit you. And so do it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it gets open like that. And then, of course, what you want to do is hold the cork very thin and turn the bottle. And so right away, that's beginning to come up. And what you want to do is have it under control and have it just, that's what you want to properly open a bottle of wine. So I've done that okay. So let's go back to sharing my screen. One, there is the La Marca. Prosecco. So let's talk about this. This is what we're having. This is what we're drinking. Um, let's actually taste it first, then we'll talk about it. As you can see, it has nice bubbles. This is made by the Charmat or bulk process, which we'll talk about in a moment. And you can see it has a really nice color. My glass, which isn't the best glass for sparkling wines, has fairly big bubbles. Typically, the smaller the bubbles, the better the wine. If you smell this wine, oh, it's just so pleasant. You know, it's a little chalky, has a really sort of lemons, maybe a little sort of white flowers to it. Oh yeah, and almost a little biscuity to it. And of course, if you taste this wine, mm, clean, very nice, etc. Let's say, and I will come back for tasting some of the other wines while there. This wine, as you can see, is 100% Glera. Now, it used to be that the grape was called Prosecco, but the problem ended up being is suddenly people in, for example, Brazil, were making Prosecco, and the Italians were not happy about this at all. And so what they decided to do, with, of course, the European Union's blessing, was in fact to go back to one of the ancient names, which was Glera. So now if you want to make a Glera, you certainly can make a sparkling Glera. You cannot make a sparkling Prosecco, and especially sell it in the European Union. By the way, the word La Marca comes from, as you can see, La Marca Trevignana, which means around Treviso. It's the hills around there is where these grapes come from. It's a DOC in the Veneto. pH is low, 3.2. Alcohol, only 11.3. That's what's neat about sparkling wines. I don't think I've ever drunk a sparkling wine that had more than 12.5% alcohol to it. And that's because you really are talking about using grapes that aren't super ripe. Residual sugar is relatively high. You can certainly taste the sweetness, 1.7%. This is a big company. In fact, this is the #1 selling Prosecco in the United States. It is part of a cooperative that has 5,000 growers, 9 cooperative wineries, making, in fact, a number of wines other than just the Prosecco. 24,000 acres of grapes owned by this company. So pretty amazing. To see. This is what it looks like. This is around the Cartesi, what the Charmat process is. You start with good grapes. I laugh. They say ripe, juicy grapes. They typically aren't super ripe in them. You, of course, press them, and you make a wine out of them. We'll talk more about this. We talk about making other sparkling wines. Then, of course, you put it into a tank. And in fact, it's a large, rounded tank. I've got a picture to show you. It has round tops because it's under pressure. So you may have 10, 20,000 gallons of this. You put it in the tank. You add, of course, this for the second round, you add sugar and yeast, as you can see in the lower part of the slide, and it goes through a secondary fermentation. Obviously, the yeast uses the sugar to make a little bit of alcohol, typically about 1.5%, and then, of course, the carbon dioxide. It may sit on the lees, that's what the dead yeast is called in there, for, maybe 6 months, 9 months, usually not a tremendously long period of time. And then, of course, it is then taken out under pressure, typically filtered under pressure, and put in the bottle under pressure. And so that's how the Charmat or bulk process is made. And so that's what you're drinking. When you are drinking this wine, that is, in fact, what you're drinking with that wine in there. Okay? Here, of course, is a picture. And you can see, typically when you see normal tanks, they're not rounded at the top. But, of course, it makes them sturdier to have the rounded tops. And so that's what you're seeing, Prosecco tanks right there. And so they are very specific and, of course, closed off because the entire thing has to be under pressure. As you can see, in fact, I just happened to pull this off. La Marca is #1 in sales in millions of dollars, followed by Cormel, Cook's, Barefoot, Andre. And in fact, the first true champagne, Veuve Clicquot, doesn't come on until, as you can see, maybe a third of La Marca in there. Cupcake, of course, makes a pretty good sparkling wine, too. And then Ruffino actually comes as a surprise. And then, of course, Stella Rosa, which has increased tremendously, and then Chandon with that. Okay? So what we're going to talk about next is the traditional method, or as, of course, in French, the méthode traditionnelle. We can call this the champagne method, but the French hate hearing it called that. They don't want to have anything with that because, of course, other people make sparkling wines in the same method. So they want it to be called the traditional method. So don't tell the French I called it that, okay? And so that's certainly what's important in all of that. So I'm going to tell you sort of in a quick nutshell how the traditional method is made. First, wine is made just like we saw in the bulk process. And as I said, this wine, sparkling wine is a technology. And this is what you find. And it was as the technology changed throughout history that allowed us to make the wonderful sparkling wines we make today. And it really was making lemonade out of lemons. Because in Champagne, for example, it rarely got ripe enough to make a good, sturdy wine of 12.5, 13, 14% alcohol. And so consequently, they had to do something with it. And so they made these sparkling wines out of basically unripe grapes. And that's true certainly today. Champagne grapes or sparkling wine grapes are always the first grapes to be picked. Then the wines are blended. If you are blending, we'll talk more about that later. The wine is then put in a tank where they add sugar and yeast. And then, of course, it then goes into each individual bottle. And so you have micro fermentation. In each individual bottle goes a little bit of sugar and a little bit of yeast. And then, as we'll see, that goes into the warehouse and a second fermentation is done. So you have a complete second fermentation that takes place. Of course, as you can see, the yeast run out of sugar and they die. As they break down, they add character to the wine, and that character can be very, very important. And sometimes the aging process can go on for years, as we will see. Of course, then you have to get rid of the yeast, because who wants a yeasty wine unless you want a pet nat? And then they may add some sugar, because this wine is going to be very acidic. We'll call that the dosage, and we'll talk about that later. And voila, you have a sparkling wine. So the second sparkling wine is that, and in this case, I will figure out exactly how to stop sharing so that you can see me, and we'll talk about this wine. And then after we talk about this wine, I will also take some questions. Hey, how's that? Good? Okay. Wine number 2, as you saw, is the Navarran Cava. So this takes place in Spain. So again, by the way, you can see I have an array of glasses here. This is a white wine glass. And what most people feel now is that white wine glasses are best, especially for older champagnes. I think I'll hold on that. But you can see, in fact, I will sort of hold them up so you can see them. There's a number of different glasses that I have for, in fact, the sparkling wines. I tend to still like flutes because you can see the bubbles so nicely. So again, if I pour this wine, whoa, nice mousse. You can see, by the way, that's what we call the bubbles, a mousse, M-O-U-S-S-E. And so it really has the beautiful mousse in there and tons of bubbles. I mean, look at that. That's the wonderful thing about sparkling wines. I always say it looks like an upside-down blizzard. Of course, we're not having snow, surprisingly enough, but it just is amazing to see how all of those bubbles go through that wine. So again, if you smell this wine, very different and very typical, in my opinion, of cavas. They tend to be very minerally, almost sort of irony. It has that iron sort of aromas to it. Much more sharper fruit, almost a sort of unripe peach or something along those lines. That very nice. You could almost even go to like currants or gooseberries or something like that in the aroma. And of course, if you taste this wine, so clean, has a little bit of yeastiness, has again sort of like chalky character that is in that wine that really makes it, very, very nice. We'll talk a little more about the wine, but I thought first I would find out if Emily has any questions for me. Sure.
Okay, so I know you kind of just touched on it a little bit about the bubbles, but are there any other reasons why you would drink sparkling wine out of a flute versus a regular wine glass? And that question came from Leo.
And actually, that's a very good question. The reason is, and I think for a lot of wines, certainly these, in fact, probably most of what we're having tonight, flutes are perfectly fine because the bubbles carry the aroma to your nose. And typically we have the different glasses, and I tend to not be too doctrinaire when it comes to the white glasses. I do typically use a larger glass for a red wine, and I will use a glass like this for a white wine. But most people, you know how it is, it's trends, etc. The reason I like the flute is, of course, it's beautiful, and it does bring it. And so if I'm tasting most sparkling wines, that's fine. But if I am, and it does make some sense, if I'm tasting a really good champagne, say a Krug, or even a Veuve Clicquot, or any of them, in many cases, you catch more aroma in a rounder glass. And so you find a lot of people using white wine glasses now. In fact, yes, if you're aficionado, you certainly want to use a white wine glass instead of a flute, because they're now considered a bit déclassé. Other ones?
Yeah, let's do one more. So what Nicholas wants to know, what is the historical reason that brought us sparkling wine? Was it for the experience or the ease of winemaking?
Well, actually, it's tough to make. And in fact, that's always one thing that's sort of been interesting, is that I think now the federal government has changed this, but the taxes on sparkling wines used to be 3 times what they were for still wine. Still just simply means no bubbles. And I think part of the reason was because most of our sparkling wine came from France or other places. I think now the playing field has been leveled. As I said, sparkling wines, you know, it's like everything. It's trends, it's tastes. The first grapes, and we'll talk about this, I might as well mention now, the first bubbles were a nuisance. Because again, it was a re-fermentation. Very often it would cause the cork to break, or the barrel to lose the cork in it, or something along those lines. And so it was a nuisance. But it was only until, again, I won't go into everything, you know, in the lecture, but the Marquis de Sillery made it very fancy in the French court. And then it was the English. Again, in the Edwardian era, you might as well have called it the Champagne era. The English love and still love champagne. And so that's one reason. And of course it is. It's zesty. It's festive. And so, of course, that's one reason why. And again, it's wonderful for celebrations. But, you know, I think, you know, a nice Friday is reason for celebration. And so I have no problem opening sparkling wines most every day. Anything else? Or shall we go and continue? Okay. Sure, that's fine. I just have to share content. And screen. So here we are back with the wine. I can tell you a little bit about it. This is the estate. In fact, what it looks like, this is in fact something I pulled off of their own website of the estate there. I thought this was a nice picture of the cellar, and you can of course see all that wine. Navarone is really interesting. The family has owned the vineyards and the area for a long time, but it's only been the son relatively recently, and it's actually over several generations. It's an interesting family story if you go into their website, and has really sort of changed this. This is organic, by the way. This it feels organic. This it's the only one there. Beautiful countryside. As I've mentioned, operate every time. Grapes do not grow in ugly places, and it's wonderful to visit vineyard lands, and hopefully we'll all get to do that again soon. But look at that, just so beautiful. Now, this wine is also interesting. This wine is made from indigenous Spanish grapes. In other words, grapes from there. It's used 50% Xarel-lo, 30% Macabeo, and 20% Parellada. And it's interesting, the guy's last name is actually Parellada. They don't mention it anywhere. I'm thinking, well, wait, that's the same. Organically grown vines, planted from 70 to 95, tended in clay, limestone, fairly high elevation already. Spends 18 months on the yeast, which is for a cava is a long time in there. Family business since 1901. They own 271 acres of vines in the Penedès. And the Penedès, again, if you took John Doe's course, he would always talk about this because, again, you've probably heard of Freixenet and Cordonier. They're the two really big cava producers. But there are many, many great cava producers out there. And so it's sort of fun, in fact, to see. Okay. Winemaker notes, as you can see, pale gold, energetic, fire, lemon, and melon scents. Smoky mineral. I get certainly that smokiness in their ripe citrus orchard fruits. Wilfred Wrong, who writes for wine.com, and I think is a very good presenter. He's always fun to revive. One step further, excellent Christmas, invites food pairings to al fresco occasions. Wine's playful and fine. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's good. Aromas and flavors of tart citrus and green apple should pair it well with tuna, sashimi, but probably many, many other things too. By the way, I find sparkling wines go with sushi all the time, and many, many other things, as I have told you. So it makes it fun. Okay. Hopefully that will come up. Oh, I don't know if I missed. Maybe I missed one. Crémant. Crémant is the French term for sparkling wines. And as you can see, in fact, on this map, this is, in fact, it was a word that used to be used. If you read older text about Champagne, etc., you will see that one of the words that they used was crémant. Another thing you'll hear is vin mousseux, which is sparkling wines. But it was a word that really fell out of favor, out of use in Champagne. And so it was really the people in Alsace who decided that they were going to start using that name. And so that's what they did. And as you can see, crémants, which are in fact increasing tremendously on the world stage, is found in all kinds of places, even in Bordeaux. And of course, I laugh. I just attended a virtual Bordeaux seminar, and they're like, oh, our sparkling wines have increased 10 times. Well, it still is 1% of the output. So it shows you just how sometimes you have to think about what the real numbers are, even if it has increased 10 times. And so that, in fact, is the crémant in there. So again, as I said, this is a class. We need to taste as we go through. And so the next wine that you're having is the Lucien Albrecht. And again, maybe I will stop sharing. I'm getting better at this, which is sort of scary. And it is sort of scary. The Lucien Albrecht, for one thing, isn't that a great color? I mean, it just is so beautiful. It's a Brut Rosé. And again, I'm going to hopefully quickly, there's a red, see, there's a gold tab there. Aha, I actually found it. The gold tab there. You can take that off. By the way, I have a number of different things that I will use to cork the wines in afterwards. I know I had told you to buy them. They're great because, again, sparkling wines give off CO2. And because they give off CO2, you are able then, air doesn't get in there, and so you're able to do this. So let's see how I do this time. As I said, non-dominant hand, make the turn, hold it in. I can feel it coming up. You can see, in fact, if you look carefully, that the cork is up. And if I very quickly do this, so there, that's how you open a bottle of sparkling wine. And don't you forget it. Again, you pour this, and it's a beautiful mousse and a great color. And the reason it has this great color, and in fact, and I should have looked more carefully. It'll be interesting to find out, by the way, again, the label, which you'll see again in a moment. Again, wow. Look at that. I hope you can see that with the light coming through. It is an absolute blizzard. By the way, have you ever noticed that all the bubbles come from the exact same spots? The reason being is you need a point source. And so what happens is it's the imperfections in the glass that will allow the bubbles, basically the molecules of CO2, to accumulate to make a bubble. And that's what you see. Sometimes you'll see something floating through, and it may be, in fact, a little piece of cellulose that will also sort of float through, and it will provide a point source. So that's what you see there. So again, if you smell this wine, oh, so different. You know, because again, it's a rosé, and you'll see this is 100% Pinot Noir. Cherries and strawberries, and it's full and round. Oh, this is really, this is truly a fine wine. This is one of the reasons I wanted to use this, because the quality, I think the price quality ratio on this wine is through the roof. Certainly one of the best. So again, if you taste this, dry. Again, more cherries, and actually, you know, almost like the skin of the cherry, because it's got that dryness, and almost, I would think, a little bit of tannin in there. So it's really very full. You could have this with so much different foods. I really think you could actually have this. You could probably have this with, you know, something off the grill, because it has that smokiness, it has that intensity of flavor that's really nice. But certainly pork, certainly chicken, certainly any number of vegetables would be really, really good with this wine. That's one thing that a lot of people don't realize. we think of sparkling wines as an aperitif, where in so many cases they can go right to the meal depending on the weight of the wine and the way they are. And so that's what you're seeing there. I'm going to go back. As soon as I figure out where. Share content. Back we go. Again, you see this is Lucien Albrecht. We already talked about that. Gorgeous countryside. I always say, and I know it's a cliche, I was like, oh God, Jackie said it. But really, if Disney were going to make a vineyard, it would look like Alsace. You got these beautiful little Baroque villages. You've got flowers everywhere. I didn't even belabor you with all the flower pictures I had from there. It's beautiful countryside. The Vosges Mountains are in the background. You have the forest on the top, the vineyards on the hillside. It is glorious. This is, in fact, they own several Grand Cru vineyards, the Albrechts do. And so these are, in fact, a couple of their vineyards that you're seeing there. By the way, more than one person probably owns it. They probably don't own that entire hillside. There is, in fact, are multiple owners of that. Here is the nitty gritty, 100% Pinot Noir, 100% hand harvested, extended and soft pressing, as it says. Slow fermentation, 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, controlled fermentation in stainless steel. So they probably, in fact, it probably doesn't get its color from the dosage as many wines do. We'll talk about that in a minute. It probably, in fact, has color all the way through, which is why it has more of, the French would call that eye of the partridge, eau de Perdue, because it's more of it's not a pure red or pink. It tends to be almost this gray color that it gets. It's 12 months, a minimum. Alcohol, 12.5%. Residual sugar low, 8.5 grams per liter. That would, in fact, as you see, it is a brut. It's a Crémant d'Alsace Rosé brut. I should have put that up there on the top. And so, in fact, it is in the dry side. It is a lovely wine. And not only do I think so, but Williford Wong, as you can see, gave it 93. Dazzling pink wine. Lucien Albrecht Crémant, bright red fruits, as I said, nice tangy life. The wine's brightness makes it a beautiful choice with a plate of raw salmon sashimi. You must really like sashimi. That's, of course, the second time we saw that. The enthusiasts give it 90. Again, look at the difference. Bright red fruits, and they say tart apples and fresh lemon. I think there's a little lemon, but I really get the fruits, the red fruits in there. Harmonious, round, fruit-driven, and dry. The Spectator, of course, says red currant, rhubarb, and strawberry together, very fresh and frothy, foaming mousse is exuberant and highlights the strawberry shortcake flavors brilliantly, while a totally pale, dry palate makes this stay classy. Very satisfying, fun, and fruit-driven, a serious core, and a bright, lemony finish. So quite neat and quite a wonderful wine with that, okay? So I'm going to talk about champagne before we talk about the next two wines, and I will run through these fairly quickly. Oh, I guess before I stop, any questions? Sure.
Yes, we do have a few. So Amy said, why do you not want the cork to pop? And she also didn't have the chance to get one of the stoppers that you suggested. So how should she keep the bottle good until tomorrow?
Actually, even if you have a cork around the house, typically if you just can shove the cork in pretty strongly and then refrigerate it, because the refrigeration lowers the pressure also. And so very often, I've often had a wine where if I just put a cork in it, it will be fine. A lot of places do sell them. And of course, it makes it a little better because, as you can see, it has a flange. And so what you do is you put it in and it sort of pops around this sort of wider middle. I guess I could actually show you. And so you press it down and put it in, and there it is. And so it holds all the bubbles in. But trust me, as long as there's not a lot of pressure, if you put a cork in it, sometimes, trust me, it happens to me sometimes too. Sometimes the cork will pop out if there's still too much pressure. But if you keep it refrigerated, typically it will be okay. So that's probably the best thing I can tell you. By the way, you may have heard, and people often have, about that if you put a spoon, and put the stem of the spoon down into the bottle, it will keep the bubbles. Though I will tell you too, it's amazing. A good champagne, or in fact, actually just a good sparkling wine, if the bubbles are well integrated into the material, the juice, they will hold beautifully. I mean, I have seen, I shouldn't say this, I've seen parties where someone, there was a bottle that no one opened or was opened and no one drank out, or it ended up sitting on a windowsill and we found it the next day and we went to pour it and of course it frothed beautifully. And so a good champagne, a good sparkling wine will in fact stay bubbly for a long time after it's open, even without. But again, you can just put a cork in it. Other question.
Yes. So to kind of go along with that question, Amy had a question and Scott had a question that were kind of similar. So what is the best way to store sparkling wine? And also, should you drink sparkling wine chilled on ice or at room temperature?
First thing, of course, I think sparkling wines for the most part should be chilled. I don't think too cold. I find this, especially with whites too, and trust me, I put these wines in the refrigerator probably noon. And so when I pulled them out, they were too cold. But they actually sat here next to me for over 45 minutes. And so now the temperature's not bad. The problem is when you drink the wine too cold, and this is any wine, we say the wine's dumb. It doesn't have you can't really get the aromas and flavors out of it. And so this is why you want the temperature. Now, again, fairly chilled, I would say even like 52, 55 degrees. And I'm, again, not real doctrinaire. It's going to warm up in the glass. So if it's a little cold when you start, that's okay. Maybe that's why you should have these glasses, because it stays cold a lot longer than those. But that's what I do. And so warm, no, the fizz goes too fast and it just doesn't work, especially because it sort of ups the acid too much. So that's certainly not a good idea. Storing champagne, and by the way, this is also one of those widely thought of misnomers, and that is that wine absolutely does not have to be laid flat, and that's true of anything, probably especially champagne, but even the other wines. The Cork people did a study like back in 2005, and they showed that, of course, the head space, which we call ullage, in other words, the air that's in the top of the bottle, it's at 100% relative humidity. And so the cork will not dry out if you don't have it stored in that manner. And so it can be stored upright without any problem. The most important thing is keep all wines out of the light. Keep them cool if you can, which is why, a closet or a basement or something like that is much better. And sparkling wines probably don't have that as much. Now, the French, in fact, no, not so much the French. The English like to drink older sparkling wines. But sparkling wines are really ready to be drunk when they are first released. And so you don't have to age them. But I will say I've been lucky enough to have a few sparkling wines that I did keep. Again, very good champagnes that were 15, 20 years old. If not a little bit older. And again, especially sometimes they just taste like sort of bubbly old Burgundies. They can be really, really lovely. And so don't throw out sometimes those older bottles. At least open them and taste them and maybe even let them sit for a while to see if the aromas will develop afterwards from that. Okay? Anything else?
Yeah, let's take one more really quick.
Sure.
So Chelsea and Jesse want to know, so why are there not any red sparkling wines? We know we just tasted a rosé, but what about like deep, deep red?
That's a great question. And again, if you want to try, you can get sparkling Shiraz. In other words, the Australians make a sparkling red wine. And if, again, and it's always a question of taste. The problem is that really the base wine for champagne is pretty neutral. It doesn't have, in fact, you don't want ripe grapes with a lot of flavor because it almost overpowers it. And so this is why you pick the grapes younger when they don't have a fully developed sort of fruit profile. And so even though, of course, these wines, obviously, this wine has wonderful fruit, if you were to leave it and have it riper for two things, of course, typically then the alcohol content will be higher. And then it just, I have, the ones that I've had, I mean, they're okay, but they're just sort of clumsy. They're almost too heavy for the bubbles. And that's why. But you can try them. Trust me, it's not that difficult to get a sparkling Shiraz out of Australia. I can't think right off. Someone else is going to make some, but I can't think of anyone else who's really making a red other than the Australians of sparkling wine. Oh, I will now call myself a liar. And that's because if you want something with a little bit of bubbles, again, you probably all heard of Riunite and Lambrusco's, of course. And typically, it was a nice everyday wine, but didn't have a lot of character. Well, there are a lot of producers in Lambrusco now that are making wines with amazing character. And they just have a little bit of bubbles, what the French would call pétillance, or they would call it frizzante in Italian, that are wonderful. Great fruit, wonderful, again, summertime barbecue wines, not super expensive. So try those. Those are probably, and they're becoming more and more common, and they're good, and they're red, but they won't have as much bubbles as champagne. Okay? Anything else? Okay. As I said, we're going to talk about sparkling wine, champagne, and I will not belabor these points. If you have other questions, and certainly there are a lot of great places that you can go. The CIVB or the CIVC, the Comité Interprofessionnel de Vin de Champagne, has a great website. In other words, the champagne people, they have a great website. For all this information. So I'm going to talk about champagne in particular, but it also applies to most sparkling wines, and certainly the Argaules that we're having today. This is what the soil of Champagne looks like. It's chalk, it's limestone. And limestone and chalk are very important all over the world for making great wines. You can, of course, on volcanic soils, etc. But in Italy, throughout the rest of France, in America, so many places, chalk is very, very important. And it certainly is very important in Champagne. And this is what the soil looks like. I took this picture. In fact, you can see, look at all of the fossils that are in there, because, of course, that's where it came from. Europe used to be covered by a shallow sea. And so for millions of years, shellfish, of course, lived and died. And so that's what you're seeing there. Very, very important. Champagne is weird because other places like Bordeaux or other places in France, they break up their land into smaller and smaller areas. Not in Champagne. There is only one name. You call your wine Champagne, and that is it. There's a couple other demarcations, but it's all Champagne. And it always depends on the village that determines the price of the wine, which is really strange too, because it's like there are a lot of different vineyards around the village. And in fact, a good wine Champagne house, and that's what we call them, the Champagne houses, they know where the good vineyards are, and that's who they buy grapes from. And by the way, most Champagne houses certainly do not own all of their grapes and may buy most of them. This was done, by the way, because of fraud, etc., in the 1910s, and so they set all this up. Basically, the villages are, given a number from 80 to 100. So basically, they're on a scale, and obviously, 100 is what's called Grand Cru, and you'll very often see that on the label. Below that, from 90% from the village, is Premier Cru. And then below that, 80 to 90, of course, it's just regular Champagne. Can still be wonderful. But that, in fact, is what you're seeing in there. It's cold. This is a great picture because, again, this is, I think, in the Montagne de Reims, the mountain of Reims, you see this. And, of course, they get snow often. This is why they have trouble ripening the grapes. And so that's how they started making Champagne. There are 3 grapes that are used. Actually, there's 7, but the other 3 are in such small amount that no one pays any attention to them. There are 3 grapes that are used. So, in fact, most champagnes are blends. Oh, maybe I'll have some wine instead of some water. Oh. Pinot Noir, which provides body and richness to the wine. And isn't that a great picture? I found that today, and it took me forever to get it sort of find it, but I thought that's just such a beautiful picture of those Pinot Noirs. Chardonnay, again, provides elegance and lightness to the wine, and so is used very often as part of the blend. And finally, Pinot Meunier. Of course, if you want to be very trendy, just like the French are, you will not call it Pinot Meunier. It's only Meunier. A meunier, by the way, is a miller. In other words, the person who makes flour. And it's because when these comes out, I should have added a picture, the leaf, especially when it comes out, looks like it's dusted in flour. And so it's very hairy, and so it looks like it's dusted in flour. And so that's why it's called the miller's Pinot. In other words, Pinot Meunier. In there. And there, of course, is the picture of all 3 of them. And you see it just says Meunier at the top. And they didn't even they're putting the Chardonnay in the middle with that. So those are the grapes. It is gorgeous. You have, in fact, these hillsides. There are a number of different regions, and we won't go into them all, but these are, in fact, pictures I took in 2017, and these wonderful villages, and again, the vineyards on the hillsides, etc. This shows you, while driving, I shouldn't admit that, but I did. The other thing that I really want you to look at on that picture is look at all the different plots. And those are probably all owned by different people. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of wine growers in Champagne, and most of them do not make their own sparkling wine. They sell it to the champagne houses. And so that's what you're seeing there. I'll bet there's 18 in that just small shot I took while driving down a hill with that. This is, in fact, in the south, the Aube, which is completely different. This is, in fact, what the vineyards look like there. But look at that. So typical. Forest on the hillside, or on the top of the hill, vineyards on the hillside. And then I want to say that's wheat there on the bottom. And that's so typical of wine regions across the world, but especially in France, that you will see. Picking takes place about 100 days afterwards. Most of it's still hand harvested. There's another picture, and actually I put the picture in simply because to show you harvesting by hand, but look at all the different plots in the back of that picture. So it's sort of amazing to see. Now then, you've probably heard of this gentleman. This is Dom Perignon. He was at the Abbaye Auvier. So in other words, obviously he was a monk. And he is credited by many for creating champagne. It's not true. What he did was he was very good at blending wines to make them better. So he'd take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and made it better. And we'll talk. That's very important in champagne. In fact, for him, bubbles were a nuisance because that's, of course, as you see, 1638 to 1715. And so this was before champagne became trendy or even as something in there. But after he died, he had a good publicist. And so it was one of the monks who wrote a history, gave him all kinds of credits for all kinds of things that the poor guy didn't do. Probably being a good Christian Catholic, he would have probably hated the lies told about him. But in fact, that's just the way it worked. As I mentioned, Christopher Merritt, he was the person who first started making sparkling wines. So, first of all, you take the grapes, you pick them as we saw, you press them. This was the old classic champagne press. By the way, you are pressing this when we talk about Cabernet in a couple of weeks. Of course, you let the grapes on the juice and eventually the wine to get the color. You don't want the color. That's the previous question, asking about red sparkling wines. You don't want the color, and so you press those red grapes immediately and not too hard, and that's what's important. That's why they use these really big, old, flat presses. This, in fact, is at Drapier. This is, in fact, in their sort of mini museum. Shows you, in fact, what they used in the 1800s for that. Not much different than what you saw. This is what it looks like today. Obviously, we're using much more, much better thing that you can control the pressing very, very carefully. And so that's what a modern one does. Here you see the presses at Duval-Leroy, a good champagne house there in Champagne. By the way, that's why we talk about sparkling wines and champagne. Champagne is a region. You can have still champagne. In other words, you can buy champagne that has no bubbles. It's still champagne because the word means the region, not the bubbles. Okay? So they pick all the grapes and they pick them in different lots. And of course, 3 different grapes, and they don't keep them together right away. They separate them. This is just a small portion of the tank farm at, I think it was Nicolas Feuillatte. And so they may make 60, 80, 100 different batches of wine from those grapes after they press them. And so they keep them all separately, the Pinot Meunier, the Chardonnay, the Pinot Noir. This, by the way, I had to, there's probably a couple of my people in this picture listening right now, at least I hope so. I took a class down in the spring when I taught at Luxembourg. Those of you who went, especially in my years, may remember Roland Hoff over there on the side. Matt Daniel was a student coordinator, and many other people. We had a marvelous day, but I won't go into all the information that we did that day, but we had a marvelous day there at Moet. with that. So I thought I would add a little Miami trivia there to this. So what they do then is they have a wine, and they'll have 60, 80 different batches of wine. The next thing is they want to assemble the wine, which is also called blending the cuvée, in French, the assemblage. And so this is what you see. You see that, again, it may be a team of people. They go through and they will taste all of those lots of wine and go through them. What they then do, and I should add, in fact, because I don't have a slide of it too, what I should add is they keep wine back from previous years that they will use in the blend of especially what we call their house style, which most of us drink. And in fact, the Nicolas Feuillatte we're having today is a house style. So they hold back, in some cases they may add 30 or 40% of wine from previous years to the blend, to the assemblage when they're making the cuvée. This is why champagne is normally non-vintage. The vast majority of champagne does not have a vintage date. Some will, we'll talk about that, but for the most part, they do not, because that goes in. Once they decide on the blend, they then add what's called the liqueur de tirage. Basically, they take wine, they add yeast and sugar to it, and then they blend it all together. This is at Moët & Chandon, which of course is the largest champagne producer, and this is their assembly vat. And I did the math for you. This vat is 164,000 gallons. You could swim in it. And in fact, here, of course, is the top. And this is, in fact, is the picture going down to show you how big it is. It's just gigantic. And so to that, they add the assembled cuvée, and they add yeast and sugar. And so then as soon as it's all mixed up, the next thing that they do is, of course, take it and put it in the bottle. And so this is what you see right here. It goes into, typically, of course, if you're in Champagne, it goes into the caves, and the wine sits there. In Champagne, it must sit for a minimum of 15 months, but most of the wines, in fact, including the wine we have here, will stay for 2, 3, 4, 10, 12, a long time. I hope you can see on this picture, you see the smudge at the bottom? That's the dead yeast, because of course the wine ferments and it runs out of sugar, and so the yeast die. But at the same time, they lyse, in other words, they break down, and so they add flavors to the wine, as does the aging process. I had to have another drink. And so this is what you see here. French, they used to put lath in between them. In fact, you can still see the wood. It is called sur latte. Here, of course, if it sits there a long time, it will get all covered with the mold that you'll find in the caves. This is just a small portion of the corridor at Moët. And if you look to the right and the left, that's just not a single layer of bottles. That goes all the way back. They have millions of bottles that are stored in the caves at Moët, waiting, of course, to be finished. Okay? Showing you the outside and give you an idea of how much is. This is the Charles Heidsieck. And again, what you can see there is all of the vineyards. And we're down like 40, 50 feet in the Crayères that they own there. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with Charles Heidsieck, I've used it in class many times. The shape of their bottle, they actually took from their underground caves, which in fact were dug by basically the Gallo-Romans in the 4th century. So it's truly an amazing place to visit. This is a picture I took when I was at Charles Heidsieck, and as you can see the yeast on the bottom. She shone the flashlight so I could see it. So this is the problem. All of a sudden you got all this yeast on the side. How do you get rid of it? By the way, there are, in fact, as I said, aging, non-vintage type, 15 months minimum, but typically much longer. Vintage, which is 85 from just a single year. Typically it's 100%, but 85% by law. And they usually have to be done at least 3 years. In fact, very often much, much longer. And I guess I must be on the bottom. The prestige cuvée, things like Cristal and Dom Perignon, they may spend 5-7 years or more on the yeast because it makes a difference to the wine. Okay. The next thing you have to do is, how do you get rid of that? So they used to do it by hand, and it was called riddling, remouage, and it goes into an A-frame called a pupitre. This is historically. This is, in fact, what the old pupitres looked like. They would put those bottles in there sideways. And then what you had was a remeur. In other words, he was the person who, what they would do is they would just very quickly give the bottles a quick twist and move it from horizontal to vertical. So they would very gently and delicately, over 6 to 8 weeks, get the yeast down into the neck of the bottle. Today, of course, we use computers. 5 to 7 days, done. Some people still do hand riddling, but almost never for very prestige cuvées. So this is what you're left with. This is a Nicolas Feuillatte. And as you can see in the bottom of that bottle, you see the yeast. This is another great picture of these wines on point in the yeast. By the way, one thing I didn't mention, and you look, is notice the bottle cap. It's kept like beer. And so they simply put it in there. And so champagne spends most of its time with a beer cap on it. And so that's the way it goes. And so these pictures, they have these special bottles. So you can see, oh, by the way, and I probably never even look at all the Jarrow palettes at the bottom of the screen all through there. And so that's how the wines, in fact, are done. So they come to this point where the yeast is at the bottom. The problem is now you have a bunch of gunky yeast at the bottom. So what am I going to do? What I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze that neck. And so I will put it into a vat. Typically, it may be any number of things. They used to use, of course, salted water and got it really cold. Now they use like food grade ethylene glycol or stuff like that in it for there. I meant to get, in fact, a picture from a friend of mine who made one. This is what it looks like when it's done. Obviously, now you have a frozen neck of gunk at the bottom of that in the beer can, in the beer thing. And so that's what happens. And so now it is ready for you to take off that bottle cap and, of course, eventually put the real cork into it. We call this disgorgement or dégorgement. Of course, we typically use the French term, but disgorging, meaning, of course, that plug of ice, when I take off that bottle cap, is going to come shooting out of that bottle. Here again, you see, this is hand disgorging or dégorgement. And in fact, I should have had a picture. There's a picture of an old one at Drapier that I have in there. This, of course, is modern. This was also at Drapier. And you can see they're taking, you look to see the bottle cap over there on the right. And of course, they took the bottle cap off and you can see the stuff coming out. They will then fill Saint Dosage. Did you lose me? Sure. I'm sharing my screen. It's turning. It wasn't there. Wait a second, I gotta find my thing. Okay. Oh, okay. Share. Okay. It says stop sharing otherwise. Yeah, it says stop sharing, pause, share, assign, mute me, video, reorder, participants, chat. Click video. Start my video. I started again. Am I there? Because it's still turned. I did. Okay, I will try that. There's stop my video. For some reason, it's whirling. I can tell it's not working. That's why I knew. Okay. You can still see the screen? So you just can't see me, but you hear me. Okay, good. That's great. Yeah, that's not the rest of it is important. I don't know why it's going, but it is. Hopefully, we'll come back in a moment. So I apologize. And so what you have is you're adding then the wine, and because obviously you're going to lose some wine, and of course you've lost that plug, and so now you're going to refill the bottle, and they're going to refill it with the dosage. And in this case, and this is what makes the difference in the sparkling wines that you have. If you had no dosage, and sometimes you'll see these terms, but they're not really considered to be what's what I'm looking for. They're not critical, or they're not official terms. So very often you'll see nature, natural, extra brut, brut sauvage, meaning that they typically have added no dosage to this wine. So all you're getting is the very dry wine as it was made. Above that is brut, and brut, by the way, they're all under brut because it's from 0 to 1.5% sugar with this. And so that's what you're dealing with on this wine. And so typically, almost all the sparkling wines that are sold, and certainly most champagnes, are in fact brut. And the amount of dosage you add will make a difference because sometimes, as you can see, the Lucien Albrecht we had was only 8, which is fairly low. Sometimes there'll be 1.2, 1.3, some of the differences there too. Extra dry is 1.2 to 2. By the way, you see there's overlap. Dry in there. And so then finally, demi-sec is 3.3 to 5. And so that's in fact is what's going on with all of that. Are you still hearing me, Emily? Okay, because the little screen even completely disappeared. That's why I was asking for that, making sure. So obviously then when the dosage is added, the cork is added. And as you can see, the middle picture is a champagne cork that has never been put in a bottle. And you can see there's 2 or sometimes 2 or 3 layers of natural cork, and then the rest of it is agglomerate. And then the other 2 on either side is obviously ones that have been in there. They put, by the way, a capsule on the top so that, of course, the cage doesn't go through it. And of course, you can see it's wide. They really have to squeeze it to get it into the bottle to do that. And you can see, in fact, actually the one on the right-hand side has 3 layers of natural cork. By the way, you see how the natural cork will really expand again. That's what makes cork so amazing. And it really is unique as a plant material for that. So this is what it looks like when you're done. Here's the bottle. It's got the capsule on it, or excuse me, it's got the cork in it. It has the cage around it, and basically is ready to sell. They may let it sit for 6 to 8 weeks. They won't put the label on it until it's ready to go out. But there you see it. There is, in fact, the finished product. Okay? Champagne types. Again, as we mentioned, non-vintage, house style, 15 months on the lees. Vintage, at least 85% by law, 3 years on the lees. Prestige cuvee, I don't think there's a law, but 5 to 7 years is not unusual for those wines at all. The other thing you need to know about champagne is it says there are different styles. There is Blanc de Blanc. Blanc de Blanc, of course, means white of the whites. And what this means is this champagne is 100% Chardonnay. That's, of course, if it's champagne. Now, you can use other white grapes to make sparkling wines, trust me, but in champagne, you can only, it has to be 100% Chardonnay. Typically, they're the lightest, most elegant. I will admit that probably Blanc de Blancs are my favorite style. Blanc de Noir is, of course, white of the reds. And this wine, it could be 100% Pinot Noir, or it could be a blend of Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier or Meunier in there. They typically are richer, heavier, rounder in style. And very often you get to know the style. Veuve, for example, Veuve Clicquot tends to be heavy in Pinot Noir. Part of it has to do with the grapes they can get too. So that is, and what you do with the house style is you try to make the wine taste the same every time. And we won't go into all the rest of it. And then finally, of course, Rosé Champagne. We had the Brut Rosé from Lucien Albrecht. And they've become very trendy. And it's harder to make, I think, a good rosé champagne. Usually, I think they're not as elegant as either of the other styles with that. Very often, they actually make it rosé by adding a little red wine in the dosage. In other words, when they add the sugar, they add the little red wine because then it's a better pink. Typically, if it stayed all that time in the bottle, it becomes, again, that very coppery color that we saw in the Lucien Albrecht. And so that's what's happening with that. Thirsty? Lord knows. So the next wine we're going to have, and I'm not sure if because you can't see me at all, can you now? If I stop sharing, my video. Yep, I did that. Yep. Aha! Yep. For some reason it was circling, now it stopped. Yay, sort of. Okay, Argyle. Argyle, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but again, you have the bottles, if you do have the bottle in front of you. And I will open this, or at least try to. This is always the most difficult thing to do, and I really should have started this. I think part of the problem is I'm left-handed, and I try to open it the other direction. Regardless. Aha, finally. Nice packaging, though. Don't they have nice packaging? I love the color of the bottle, too. Argyle, of course, is from Oregon, and they've been around for a long time. And let's see, again, down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and open. I have to be a little more careful because this is a little warmer. Have to get started, but once it start, whoop, see what I mean? I popped that one. Oh, well. Again, beautiful white color, nice bubbles. Ooh, and boy, the aroma, it just jumps out of the glass. By the way, that's why very often, I haven't been doing that tonight, but you can actually fill a flute almost to the top because the bubbles carry the aromas. And so it's less important. Typically, when I pour a glass of wine, even that's a lot more than I would typically pour. I usually end up pouring a third of a glass because you can always, of course, go back to the bottle. But with sparkling wines, because it's less important. Interesting, it could be the glass. I don't have as many bubbles on this wine, but it can be depending on the glass. There's all kinds of reasons for that. But oh, smell that wine. It is, again, appley, almost apples and pears. And almost a little baked apple in there. Really nice fruit. Also, there's a mineral component to that wine. And again, if you taste this wine, interesting, because not much bubbles there, but plenty of bubbles in the mouth. Very nice. Extremely clean. It's so crisp. It just has that wonderful flavors. Again, Granny Smith apple, some other flavors too. Nice acidity. And it finishes with a little of that biscuity flavors that are there because, again, of the time it's spent on the lees. Really quite lovely. Let me see here. Go back. And again, as you can see, 2015, this is Vintage Brut. Typically, what Argyle does is they do make a wine every year, and then they keep it until they need it. And then when they're selling, obviously before Christmas, they will disgorge a lot of it. So they say they disgorge on demand. In other words, they let it on the lees as long as they can. And then when the market, they need to have more, then they will disgorge more. And so that's what they do. Obviously, a minimum time, but then after that, it will be then ready for release. Here, of course, is its notes. This is 70% Pinot Noir. And it has a fair amount of grip to it, and so it's a depth, and so not surprising it's 70% Pinot Noir, 20% Chardonnay, and 10% Pinot Meunier. Notice, of course, that they use the exact same grapes as you do in Champagne. Harvested, again, because they get them from a number of different places, between August 24th and September 6th. Notice, early, which is not unusual. Brix at harvest, 19.2. That's low. typically you would expect a grape for wine to be a minimum of like 21, 22 degrees Brix, and often they are much higher. So as you can see, we're picking grapes that are not completely ripe. Alcohol, 12.5, quite typical. Barrel aging, 93% stainless. A little neutral oak, again, just to give it a little bit more creaminess and roundness with that. By the way, it just hit me when I was thinking about that with the 12.5% alcohol. There's that wonderful old song, "You go to my head and you linger like a haunting refrain, like the kicker from a glass of champagne." The reason for that is because the CO2 carries the alcohol to your bloodstream much faster. And so this is why a little bit of champagne, especially typically we often drink it on an empty stomach. And so consequently, this is why champagne, sparkling wines will often hit you or seem to more. It's partially the alcohol, but partially the delivery system caused by the CO2. Dosage is low, dosage is low, and you can tell it's crisp, 6 grams, and that's quite low for a lot of sparkling wines. They mentioned the winemaker, and of course, it is disgorged on demand. With that, okay. Here's the winemaker notes: impeccable, showcasing depth and precision. Blend providing impressive red fruited dimension, white peach, white honey, toasted brioche, which I certainly get. Dynamic acid background, certainly there. Edgy minerality, certainly true. 90 from Wines and Spirits. Fine bone sparkler with earth tone, reminiscence of Pinot Noir and Brutes. Smells of bread crust and lemon zest, vinous and zippy flavors. Polished and elegant floated, brioche and spice lingering in the finish. 90 from the Wine Spectator also. So really, in fact, a very nice wine. Lovely, lovely wine. Questions, Emily? Emily.
Okay, so we have a few. David wants to know, why do the bubbles emanate from the bottom of the glass in a single stream, and how do they continue to rise for so long?
It's a question, and this is one of the things that you will find with these wines is that the better they are and the longer time. Oh, yeah, they say disgorge on demand. Now, of course, I don't know, and I could check. I never thought about looking to see. Sometimes they will put on the back when this bottle was disgorged, but they probably haven't. But this probably spent at least three to 4 years on the yeast. And so what happens is the longer that the wine stays on the yeast, or actually in the bottle, the CO2 can become more and more bound to the wine itself. So, which is why when you first pour it, you get, of course, that first burst of bubbles, but then the bubbles stay because it takes a while for the CO2 to basically come out of the wine, form the bubbles, and then rise. And typically we say the smaller the bubble, the better the wine. I mean, you've all seen, again, obviously, if you buy a cheap sparkling wine or, like Coke or Pepsi, big bubbles and they disappear fast. And that's because there's no time for that to happen. So it's time that happens. And the bubbles seem to come from one place because there's probably, in fact, some crystal was so smooth that the bubbles couldn't form. There was no point source for them to start. And so what they would do with really fine crystal is sometimes they would go then in there and they would etch an X at the very bottom of the glass, because then it would roughen it up and give a point source for the bubbles to rise. And so that's what goes on there.
Okay,
Next.
So Carmen wants to know what the difference between sparkling wines and ice wines is. She said they couldn't find one of the brands that you suggested, so they got an iced wine instead for one of them.
Oh, okay. I don't think it would be sparkling. Ice wines are really, again, we find a lot of them. They make them in Ohio. They make them in Germany. In this case, it's the exact opposite. What they do is they've left the grapes on the vine, and to make a true ice wine, it has to be left on the vine until it gets cold enough. And this is like 12, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, so that the grapes freeze on the vine. And then they pick the frozen grapes and they press it. So what you have frozen is the water. And so what you're getting is typically just the essence of those grapes in there. And so typically ice wines are very, very sweet. and typically very expensive. It's a real worry with climate change. In Germany, they've now gone for their second year where it never got cold enough to make ice wine. And it used to be for example, up in Ontario, they would have over 20 times during the wintertime where it would get cold enough to make ice wine. There are some years it's only 2 or 3. And you want it to happen early because the earlier, say, before Christmas, then the grapes are in better shape because they haven't been freezing and thawing and all those things. By the way, they have to protect them from the birds too. And so they're better if they can pick it early. Luckily, I know a number of places we did have a good early cold snap, and so they were able to pick their ice wine grapes early this year.
Okay, let's do one more.
Okay.
So Kendall, Morgan, and Katie ask, so they've noticed that pouring champagne and Prosecco is different than pouring other types of wine. Could you do a live demonstration and tips on how to best pour, like how to not get the fizz?
Actually, and I will do that with the last one, but you sort of want the fizz, and there should be enough fizz, so it shouldn't be a problem. In fact, a lot of people will tell you, again, I've never been so doctrinaire, but it's the exact opposite of pouring a beer. You know, when you pour a beer, you pour it down the side of the glass and then build the head. With sparkling wine, you want to pour it into the glass, and of course, you pay attention to the rising bubbles and stop and then fill it. But yeah, typically they don't want you pouring it down the side of the glass. They want you. I never have completely understood that, but I know I've got a dear, dear friend, and she's adamant about that you pour the wine into the glass for that. And trust me, especially, I mean, any of these sparkling wines will have enough bubbles that they will last for a long time. Again, most of the bubbles are gone on this one, but if I taste them, and again, it's been out for a while, it's a little warmer, but it still has nice bubbles to it. And so typically you don't have to worry about that. That's why, of course, it is nice having a stopper, because again, if you are, you put it away, and then when you can take it off for your next glass, and so you'll know that there'll be plenty of bubbles left for you in your glass. Okay. Okay. We'll resume. Okay. Content, and back we are. Okay. So that, of course, covers sparkling wine. By the way, you will find, other than Korbel, this has always been a bone of contention between, of course, one of many, between the French and the Americans, is we use a lot of terms for things that are obviously European. Swiss cheese, Roquefort, a number of things like that. And the Europeans don't like it. So what you have is, and champagne was always a sticking point. Now we finally agreed that we can still, there are some people, especially Korbel, that have been grandfathered in, and so they can call their wine still California's champagne. But they really should call it California sparkling wine, because that's what it is, and there's no shame in that. You find almost no other sparkling wine in America that uses the term champagne. And there are lots of reasons, but the main one is they're mainly owned by European companies. And so Domaine Chandon is owned by Moet de Chandon. And I could go on and on about the various houses. And so they would never use the word champagne on their wine. It is sparkling wine, which is exactly what it is. And again, all champagnes are not sparkling. And so that's what you have there also. I like using sayings during class very often. And under our current situation, I thought this one has probably more resonance than it ever has in my class. And that is this quote from Paul Cadell. And finally, gentlemen and ladies, in the little moment that remains to us between the crisis and the catastrophe, we might as well drink a glass of champagne. And so, let's have a glass of champagne, shall we? This, of course, the last wine we're having is Nicolas Feuillatte. I will, in fact, I will stop. I will stop sharing, so unfortunately you have to see me again. Yep, there I am. Again, this is very nice. See, it says here, open, what does it say here? Open with care. Good idea. In there, again, right there on the side. So I will take care to open. Do, 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 do. Aha. You'd think I'd done this before. And of course, you put that down, 6 turns. And I have to be extra careful because now this has been up for about an hour and a half out of the fridge. And so I will start the turn. And again, you can see it's open and up there very nicely. But again, hopefully I will keep it under control. Oh, it made my night, let me tell you. So again, so when said, yes, typically you would pour right through the middle. So pretty. Again, not a tremendous amount of bubbles, and part of it may be the glass, a number of things like this. I'm actually sort of surprised, but it does have bubbles, and they are very, very small bead. And as someone mentioned, all the bubbles, in fact, coming from the exact same point source. Again, if you smell this wine, a completely different animal. I mean, it's darker, it's richer, it has a very, very different aroma profile. And again, nothing wrong with any of these wines. I mean, the Argyle is delicious. The Lucien Albrecht, I think, is wonderful. But it just does. It has a richness to it that you don't really find in the other wines. Oh yes, and just it's a wonderful sort of, again, that the bread, the brioche kind of aromas that are there, and it's a little sweet, almost herbal, almost like a little chamomile. My students typically feel I'm on drugs when I say these things. And of course, you taste this wine. Now there's a mousse. Wow. And oh, and you see, it has that wonderful toastiness to it. It's nice and clean, though, at the same time. Has a really nice, full mouthfeel to it. Yum. That's technical, by the way. Uh, oh, yeah, beautiful, nice aromas to it. Mm, 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 mm. Lovely, lovely wine. Um, again, so a little bit about. Uh, let me go back to tell you a bit more about this wine, because I can figure out where I'm supposed to be this time over here. Just amazing. Do. There we go. I do 12 or 15 of these. I might actually get it down. Anyway, Nicolas Feuillade Champagne. We were lucky enough to visit with friends. This, of course, is their brand new building. As you can see, I love the lights that, of course, look like bubbles up there above. This is, of course, and they will be happy. This is just a small portion of the tanks that are there. I took that picture, and it just really it's just sort of an amazing place to visit. This is Nicolas Feuillade, but it almost doesn't matter. What happens is Nicolas Feuillade is a cooperative, just like we talked about with the first wine, with the Prosecco. And so it's a cooperative, but the problem is you need a name and you need almost like a face. And so he was a winemaker and fairly minor, but they decided, again, maybe because the name was good, though Feuillade isn't the easiest thing to spell, they decided that they were going to make him the face and the name of their cooperative. And so that's where it came from. It is the #1 selling champagne in France, and I think might be It really does. They do everything. I mean, they really spared no expense. This is, of course, just part of the bottling line that you can see. And this, in fact, might be right after, in fact, it's been filled, because you can see they're covered with beer tops to that. This, in fact, is the front of the building in there. And they do a lot of marketing and the whole bit. And they make, I think, some very, very nice wines in there. And certainly, certainly for the price. As you can see, this wine is their Reserve Exclusive Brut. It's 20% Chardonnay, 40% Pinot Noir, and 40% Meunier. By the way, it's been really interesting to see how the changes are happening. Meunier has always been like, they use Meunier. And now it really is coming to its own. And a lot of people there, you can now buy champagnes 100% Pinot Meunier or Meunier. And they really are very good. It spends at least 3 years on the lees. So again, much longer than the 15 months. And the dosage is 10 grams per liter, 1% or 10 grams per liter. And so a little, obviously, sweeter than the Argau, and I think that's true. Actually, sweeter than the Lucien Albrecht, or at least the sugar. The problem with me telling you the sweetness, and I feel the same way myself, is it's a question of perception. If it has a lot of acid, even if it has more sugar, it's like that lemonade kind of thing. Even if it has a lot of acid, you can add more sugar and it's balanced. And so that's why they add the sugar. They want to balance it. So it is crisp and clean and refreshing, but at the same time can be really fun to drink. And so that's what you find with this wine here. 91, The Spectator, aperitif-style champagne with flavors of creme de cassis. I don't know. Lemon curd, yes. Pastry riding on a creamy mousse and framed by a crisp blonde acidity. Drink now through 2020. Again, that's part of the problem with champagne. We don't really know the disgorgement date. In fact, they've gotten better about telling you when the wines, because again, there will be differences from batch to batch. They try to make them minor, but let's face it, there are differences. James Suckling gave it 91. Cooked peaches with apples and hints of spices fall through a full body, which certainly has full body with rich fruit, very creamy texture, flavorful finish, fun amount of spiced pears, which is certainly there with apples there, light bitterness in the finish. Drink now. Okay, if I have to. With that, okay? I will be happy to take questions, and so that really sort of runs the thing. But I want to end the presentation with probably one of my favorite quotations anywhere, but especially about champagne. By the way, before I say this, I will tell you, probably no other wine region, other than maybe now California, modern day California, have women played a stronger role in a champagne region than Champagne, or in any region, wine region than Champagne. I did not mention the widow Clicquot, Veuve Clicquot. She was the person who first came up with the idea of getting rid of the yeast, and how. She also ran her company. Madame Pommery, there are many, many people. And one of them, in fact, was Lily Boulanger, the Bollinger, or Boulanger in French. Of course, she ran the house and was very strong. And she says, I drink it when I'm happy and when I'm sad. Sometimes I drink it when I'm alone. When I have company, I consider it obligatory. I trifle with it if I'm not hungry, and I drink it when I am. Otherwise, I never touch it unless I'm thirsty. Cheers. And I will again stop sharing. And I'm back.
Perfect. Are you ready for questions?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll do about 5 or 6 questions. Some of them are relevant to the wines you had tonight, and some are more just about you and what you like.
And I will try. I apologize, but I had 175 questions from the last time, and yeah. I've tried to write a number of them, but again, between putting this together, I am far from done. But I will try to get to all of you, and hopefully answer a few of those questions this evening.
Okay? Oh yeah, we totally understand, Jack, and we appreciate everything that you do for us, and I know everybody else does too.
By the way, I will tell you right now, and I sort of apologize, but very shortly, I certainly within the next day or two, I will be getting to Emily the wines that we will be using for the Cabernet tasting on the 12th. And I will also tell you that One of them will be, in fact, Burgess Cabernet. And for those of you who can get that wine here in Ohio, but Steve Burgess, who of course is Tom's son, Tom was of course the 61 alum, they are cutting us a deal. And so you will look for the special code that you will get if you need to get the wine from Burgess. And I will hopefully have that out in the next day or two. We'll be doing one Bordeaux and then of course probably one from at least Argentina, and then some California Cabernets. I thought I would tell you that so you would know to look for it.
Great. Oh, that's good information. And for those of you, we'll post that on the website and the registration page. But for those of you that have already registered for that wine tasting, that is a part of our virtual alumni weekend. We will send you out the wines as soon as Jack pulls those together. But he puts a lot of work and a lot of time into selecting these wines, so we really appreciate that. But okay, so I'll start with some of the questions. So Carmen, let me get to them really quick. So Bree would like to know, if you are interested in more wine education, what do you recommend in terms of sommelier training?
Well, obviously, there's the Cordon Sommelier. Probably, again, the Society of Wine Educators does things online, and they have books. I'm a member of the society. Also very good, a number of people use WSET, which was originally an English course, but you will find that also. And then, of course, there's 2 or 3 different levels for the sommelier. Because I'm in education, I haven't really looked at those. Again, though I have found that if you took the wines course and paid attention, you could certainly typically pass the first level in both the Society of Wine Educators and the WSET without much difficulty.
Perfect. Thank you. Whitney would like to know, what is the significance of the wines on the shelf behind you?
Actually, of course, part of it's window dressing, because I thought, we need to make this look nice. And you'll see, in fact, there are, a number of sparkling wines back there. I've had them from various good places. The Perrier Jouet, the Belle Epoque, now, in fact, called that again, though here it was Fleur de Champagne, is made by Emile Gallet and is absolutely beautiful. Probably the best wine, of course, Krug. If you're looking for a gift, I'll take Krug anytime. Again, it's worth hundreds of dollars, and it's just absolutely delicious. I've been able to drink a couple of the Dom Perignons. The one on the far end has a special significance. It's a very old Taittinger. When I was working on coursework up at Ohio State, I worked in a wine shop, and so I also worked on New Year's Eve, and we treated ourselves to that beautiful Taittinger Chardonnay champagne. And so that's always had a special. I've had it for a long time now. So that's what those bottles are.
That sounds like a good New Year's Eve. So Victoria, Victoria and her family want to know, do you recommend sabering champagne? And could you explain what that means, actually? Because I didn't know what it meant before I looked it up.
Sure. I'll be honest. I really like sparkling wines and champagne. And so anything that wastes champagne, I'm not a fan of. For example, I can't watch Formula One because it's like afterwards they just spray all that wonderful champagne all over the place. And I think, what a waste. So I can't really think much of this. By the way, if you go online, I show this in class. If you look at, and I may be under Djokovic and champagne, the poor guy almost took out his eye by opening. He actually shook the big bottle and then looked at it when he opened it. I thought, oh my God, he was very lucky. He did not take out his eye. You can probably find the video, because I certainly have a copy with that. So sabering, yeah, I can find it here. Well, if you look very carefully on your bottle, and it can be any bottle, obviously there is a seam, okay? And so the seam is right up there on the edge, and that's what you want to find. You want to make sure you find the seam. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't have a butter knife down here, but what you do is on the unopened bottle, you take the thing off, and then you find the seam, and then you run your knife or saber up along that. And what it does is it catches the rim right here, and it breaks off the top of the bottle. And really, if you do it right, my friend Chuck Warner down at the Dilly Deli, he was sabering a number of bottles, in fact, right before Christmas. And you will not lose any, but very often the wine goes everywhere. And all I can think of is, I'm not drinking that wine. So consequently, I'm not I've sabered a bottle or two, but I'm less of a fan because I'd rather just drink it.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Personal preference.
I've never done it, but I've seen it on TV, and I feel like it wastes a lot of wine.
It can, and not always, but it can. I mean, some people, you can do it and not lose a drop, but very often it's like, especially because you sort of shake it when you do it or what happens, and so you'll lose a lot of wine. Other questions?
Yeah, so Erica wants to know the proper way to hold a wine glass. So does holding the bowl of the glass change the temperature and then the chemistry as well?
Yes, and especially the temperature. And also, of course, you get fingerprints on the glass. So you'll find, especially, I mean, if you talk to me, I will hold the wine by the thing, but especially if I'm in a group for some reason, I like holding my wine by the foot. That's, of course, the bottom of the thing. So very often you'll see me hold the wine like this. Again, anything that just doesn't do this. Of course, again, a story I often tell is I worked at a wine shop. And so when we would go out, we would go to a place that famously in Columbus kept their white wines glacially cold. And so consequently, and by the way, sometimes it ends up being because they store beer there, and they store beer a lot colder than they do wines. And so if they take the wine out of there, it's going to be too cold. And so you will see me very often. Again, my dear friends at Crew, you'll often see me, of course, the first thing I do is put my hands over it to warm it up because you can't smell it if it's too cold. By the way, for those of you, of course, of a certain age, when they used to serve like cold duck, on the bottle it said "serve very cold." That's because they wanted you to drink it and have it down in your stomach before you could taste how bad it was. Because again, when it's cold, you can't taste it. That's the way it works. Other questions?
Yeah, so we have 3 more. We'll answer 3 more. Obviously, we have a lot of other questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but we'll just go with these 3. So both Josh and then also Chloe asked this too. How do you showed a picture of dead yeast before? How do you get rid of the dead yeast in a wine bottle? How do they do that? Do they shake it or what?
As I said, yes. The thing is they freeze the neck. So once they get it down to the bottle, down to the neck of the bottle, you freeze it so it all sticks together. And then you just take off the lid, and because you're now under 6 atmospheres of pressure, that ice plug simply shoots out. And so then you fill it back with wine and the sugar and then put it on. So that's what you do. You freeze the neck, and that's how you get everything out without having that happen.
Oh, good. Thank you. We had a couple questions on that, so that's perfect. So 2 more. Let's see. Cassandra wants to know, what is the best place to visit to see the process of a sparkling wine?
Wow, that's a good question. And the thing is most places are happy for visitors, especially in California. And so, for example, I've had wonderful visits at Moet. I've had wonderful visits at Gloria Ferrar, which is owned by Freixenet. They also make really nice wines. Also, Domaine Mum, Mum Napa. They also, of course, you can go to Champagne. It used to be, especially, in so much of Europe, they would be closed off and like visitors. Why would you have visitors? Well, they've all learned that wine tourism is big business. And so you can, in fact, see sparkling wine made in a number of places. I was really lucky. Some of the pictures I use in class, and you can probably get it, was from Scharfenberger, which again is a smaller place in California, and they also showed it. But yeah, any of those places will have tours so that you can see that. Certainly in California, it's really interesting too. Sparkling wines become a really big business. But what they do now is a lot of people don't make their own sparkling wine. They actually give their juice to a company. And so they take it, they do all the work we talked about, and then they give it back to the winery to sell their sparkling wine. And so they don't have to go through all of this. There are, in fact, specific companies that do this now on the West Coast.
Okay, so I think you might have answered this question earlier, but not sure. So, the nicest sparkling wine that you've ever had, and what was the occasion? Would you say it was that New Year's Eve bottle of wine, or have you had a nicer one?
That wine was truly special. And the thing about wine is there's so much that goes into it. It's where you are. It's who you're with. I mean, not only, because in fact, we don't typically drink wine, if you're lucky, in a sterile white room, just thinking about the wine. And so part of it ends up being that way. Certainly one of my favorite things was I was lucky. I got a fairly, for some, I don't remember why, it was not very expensive, but I had the 1990 Pol Roger. It was a Blanc de Blanc. And I kept it for, probably didn't come out until the mid to late 90s. And I probably drank the last bottle in 2015. And so the wine had been aged, and it was literally like tasting a slightly sparkling white Burgundy. And it was really delicious and really special. And it really is sad. Sometimes I feel I should write things on the back because, again, Krug is truly wonderful. Yeah, I've been lucky enough just to have some really good wines. And it's like so many things. Yes, the wines are wonderful. It's the people that make it wonderful. I find that so often. It really is.
I like that answer. Okay, this is I know I said only three more, but this is a really quick one. So we'll end on this one. So Megan, who is a Miami Design School alumna, she wants to know where you got those wine stoppers behind you. She said they look like some classics.
Oh, aren't they? Yes. In fact, and I have to remember, and this is a classic. Isn't that great? I mean, you can just tell. I mean, it just screams design so well. And luckily, again, a dear friend gave this to me. Happened to see it and it's like, oh, that is really great. And this one I've had forever. And of course, I don't like these. I never use these wine openers. To me, a waiter's corkscrew, of course, I didn't need one tonight, so I didn't bring one down with me. I usually have them laying everywhere, so I don't see one right now. But a waiter's corkscrew is my favorite. And the winged ones I've never been a fan of. But from a look standpoint, they're just wonderful. And so that's why I really like them. And so, yeah, so I got that from a good friend. Yes. I'm glad you noticed them. I really, really like those.
Yeah, you have a great background. Several people have commented on that. But I think that's all the questions that we're going to take for tonight. We will send you the questions afterwards. But thank you so much, Jack. If you have any final remarks before we end this.
Yes. Thank you all. I mean, this has it's been great fun. To know, and in fact, I know a number of you out there have sent me notes about how you were going to be listening in. And even though, we're not getting a chance to sort of talk one-on-one, just to be able to make this connection just really makes me feel good. And it makes me really, really happy that you took the time to sit on all this. And I truly appreciate it. So again, cheers.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful evening, Jack. I hope that you all had a great time. Thank you for tuning in. The recording will be available on the ALC website, and I will send it to those of you that registered on Monday. So feel free to please share this with friends or family members that were not able to attend. Jack will be back, like you said, in just 2 weeks on June 12th when he joins us for the red wine tasting as a part of our virtual alumni weekend. There's so many fun virtual activities taking place on June 11th, 12th, and 13th, including Alumni College, virtual trivia, virtual yoga, and even a live toasted roll demo by your very own Mark Masechko, who was monitoring the chat and questions tonight. Thank you, Mark. So be sure to visit www.miamialum.org to sign up for all of the fun events we have planned. And of course, be sure to sign up for Jack's wine tasting as well. That'll be on Friday night, the 12th. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Have a great weekend. And as always, love and honor.